On the dawn of March 15, 1851, the housemaids of the imposing plantation house of Colonel Nathaniel Whitmore entered the private study and found something that would forever change the history of Charleston, South Carolina. The respected church deacon, the man everyone revered as an example of Christian virtue and Southern honor, was kneeling before his Bible with blood-stained hands, murmuring incomprehensible confessions. Beside him, on the mahogany desk, lay a shattered pocket watch and dozens of letters written in feverish handwriting, all addressed to a man who could never read them. But it wasn't the scene of penance that horrified the servants. It was what they discovered when they opened the locked drawer of his desk. Hidden there beneath ledgers and legal documents were the colonel's secret journals, 7 leather-bound volumes documenting day after day his obsession with a slave. A man named Samuel, purchased at the Charleston slave market for $3,000, the highest price ever paid for human flesh that season. The records revealed something Charleston society could never accept. Colonel Whitmore hadn't bought Samuel to work on his cotton plantations in the Low Country. He had bought him because, for the first time in his 55 years of life, dedicated to Baptist morality and good manners, he had felt something the church condemned as mortal sin. And now, just 24 hours after the purchase, he trembled in terror not for what he had done, but for what he knew he would do. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments what country you're watching from. Comment where you're watching from. What you're about to hear now, history books tried to hide for over 170 years. The heat of February 1851 turned Charleston into a furnace. At Ryan's Slave Mart on Chalmers Street, the largest slave market in South Carolina, the air was so thick it seemed impossible to breathe. The smell was unbearable. Sweat, urine, fear, rotting flesh mixed with the salt of the harbor and the magnolia perfume that white ladies wore to disguise the horror. It was there, in that hell under the scorching Carolina sun, that Southern wealth was built upon the suffering of thousands of souls torn from Africa. Among the buyers crowding under the stone arches stood Colonel Nathaniel Whitmore, one of Charleston's most respected men. Widowed for 10 years, childless, he had dedicated his entire life to Baptist faith and cotton business. He was a deacon at First Baptist Church, a prominent member of the Charleston Library Society, and close advisor to the governor. His reputation was impeccable, his fortune considerable, his loneliness absolute. That morning, Nathaniel wasn't looking for slaves for his plantations. He already had over 200 working the cotton fields. He was there at his overseer's insistence, who claimed to need strong men for specific work in the rice fields he maintained near Georgetown. But fate had other plans. When the auctioneer announced lot number 33, the crowd of buyers stirred. It was a group of 6 men recently arrived from the Carolinas interior, all classified as prime field hands. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Josiah Crawford, climbed up and down the small wooden platform, examining the captives as if they were racehorses. "Attention, gentlemen. This here is premium stock. Look at this musculature. This Negro worked the turpentine camps for 8 years and survived. That's a guarantee of strength and endurance." The man on the platform was around 30 years old. His skin was dark as polished ebony, and his body appeared carved by divine hands. He stood approximately 6 feet tall, had broad shoulders, arms thick as tree trunks, and a scar cutting across his chest from shoulder to abdomen, testament to some ancient battle or brutal punishment. But it wasn't just his physical strength that drew attention, it was his bearing. While the other slaves kept their eyes down, submissive and broken by the horror of bondage, this man looked directly at the buyers, not with defiance, but with a dignity that seemed impossible for someone chained and standing naked before an audience of white gentlemen. It was as if, even in that condition of extreme humiliation, his soul remained untouched. Nathaniel felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades, perhaps never. It wasn't simply physical attraction, though he couldn't deny the man's body impressed him in a way that deeply disturbed him. It was something more complex. Fascination, curiosity, an inexplicable desire to know what lay behind those eyes that refused to look down. "How much for the 6?" shouted a planter from Georgia. $1,500 for the lot, responded the auctioneer, "but I can sell separately. Anyone wanting to take this specimen alone, $800? Nathaniel wasn't a man of impulsive purchases. He managed his fortune with the same rigidity with which he conducted his spiritual life. Every expense was calculated, every investment analyzed. But in that moment, something in him broke. Without thinking, Without calculating, without consulting his overseer, he raised his hand in the air. $3,000! The silence that followed was absolute. $3,000. That was more than double what any slave, no matter how strong, was worth on the market. It was an absurd, scandalous price. Josiah Crawford froze for an instant, not believing what he heard. "Colonel Whitmore, sir, you said 3,000. I did, and I want the papers ready within the hour." The auctioneer, recovering from initial shock, smiled with greed. "Sold to the most illustrious Colonel Nathaniel Whitmore. May God bless this transaction." As the gavel struck the table sealing the transaction, Nathaniel finally lowered his eyes. What had he done? Why had he paid that fortune? What did he expect from that man? He had no answers. Only a disturbing certainty. His life had just changed forever. In Josiah Crawford's cramped, dimly lit office, Nathaniel signed the purchase documents and received the bill of sale. The slave now had a registered name, Samuel. It wasn't known if this was his real name or just a designation given by the traders. He was listed as African-born Negro, approximately 28 to 30 years, no apparent vices, Crawford & Sons brand on right shoulder. "Excellent acquisition, Colonel," said the auctioneer while counting the gold coins. "This Negro is worth every dollar you paid. Tireless worker for sure." Nathaniel didn't respond. He tucked the papers into his leather case and left the office without looking back. Outside, Samuel waited, now dressed in a rough cotton shirt and torn trousers, feet still bare and hands free from chains. For the first time, the two stood face to face, without the mediation of the auctioneer or the auction platform. "What is your real name?" asked Nathaniel, in a low voice, almost a whisper. The man looked at him with those deep eyes and answered in English with a slight accent but perfectly understandable. "Kwame, but you can call me whatever you want. It doesn't matter anymore." "Why do you speak English so well?" "I learned from missionaries in Virginia before they sold me south." Nathaniel felt a lump in his throat. There was something in that voice, in that resignation mixed with a spark of resistance, that touched him in a way he couldn't understand. "I'll call you Samuel," he said finally. "That's the name on the papers." "As you wish, sir." They climbed into the carriage waiting on the street. During the entire journey to the Colonel's townhouse on Meeting Street, neither spoke a word. Nathaniel looked out the window, feigning interest in the busy city streets, while his mind boiled with thoughts he dared not admit. Beside him, Samuel remained motionless, hands resting on his knees, breathing calm, eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. When the carriage stopped before the three-story townhouse with its wrought-iron balconies and shuttered windows, Nathaniel descended first and gestured for Samuel to follow. The housemaids waiting at the main entrance looked with curiosity at the new slave, especially Martha, the oldest house servant who had commanded domestic services for over 20 years. "This is Samuel," announced the Colonel, with an authority that tried to disguise his own confusion. "He won't work the fields. He'll stay here in the house. Martha, prepare the back room next to the library. Samuel will be my personal assistant." Martha's eyes widened. Personal assistant? The Colonel had never had an assistant. He'd always taken care of his own affairs, his own correspondence. What had changed? But it wasn't her place to question. She simply nodded and led Samuel to the back of the house. Nathaniel climbed to his room, locked the door, and for the first time in decades let himself fall to his knees before his private prayer corner. He tried to pray, but the words of the Lord's Prayer died in his throat. He tried to ask forgiveness, but didn't know exactly what he was apologizing for. He tried to understand what he'd done, but the more he thought, the less he understood. Only one certainty tormented him. He had bought Samuel not to work, but because, for the first time in his entire life, he had felt something the church taught was abomination. And now, with that man under his roof, under his responsibility, under his power, he didn't know if he'd have the strength to resist what his long-repressed soul was beginning to awaken. That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep. He sat at his writing desk, with a candle lit and a pen in hand, trying to put on paper the whirlwind of thoughts consuming him, and thus began the first of his secret journals, the first record of an obsession that would destroy him. The first days after Samuel's arrival at the townhouse were of calculated silence and distance. Colonel Nathaniel maintained his rigorous routine, church services at 6 in the morning at First Baptist, meetings with the Library Society members, management of his properties, and every night long hours locked in his library. Samuel in turn fulfilled the tasks assigned to him with a silent efficiency that impressed Martha and the other servants. But that distance wasn't natural, it was forced. A desperate attempt by Nathaniel to deny what he felt every time he crossed paths with Samuel in the hallways, every time he heard his voice answering some order, every time his eyes involuntarily lingered on that imposing figure. It was Nathaniel who broke the silence. A week after the purchase, he called Samuel to the library right after supper. The room was spacious, with mahogany bookcases reaching from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound books. There was a globe in the corner, maps on the walls, and a fine wood desk where the colonel spent hours working on his commercial correspondence and society affairs. "Can you read?" asked Nathaniel without raising his eyes from the papers before him. Samuel hesitated before answering. It was dangerous for a slave to admit he could read. He could be seen as a threat, as someone capable of forging freedom papers or spreading abolitionist ideas. But there was something in the tone of the question that didn't seem like a trap. "Yes, sir. Missionaries taught me in Virginia. I can read English and a bit of Latin." For the first time, Nathaniel raised his eyes and looked directly at Samuel. "Latin? The ministers said I had aptitude for studies. I even helped them transcribe mission documents." The colonel stood and walked to one of the shelves. He withdrew a heavy volume and extended it to Samuel. It was an edition of St. Augustine's Confessions in Latin. "Read the first paragraph of the 3rd page." Samuel held the book carefully, as if it were a sacred relic. He opened to the indicated page and began to read, first slowly, then with more confidence. "Inquietum est cor nostrum donec requiescat in te—" "Stop," interrupted Nathaniel with a choked voice. "Translate. Restless is our heart, until it rests in thee, O Lord." The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Those words, written more than 1,000 years before by a saint who had spent his entire youth struggling against his own carnal desires, seemed to echo in the colonel's library like a prophecy or condemnation. "Why did the missionaries sell you?" asked Nathaniel, sitting back down. "Because they discovered I read more than I should. They found forbidden books hidden in my quarters, books about philosophy, about the nature of man, about freedom. They said I was contaminated by heretical ideas." "And were you?" Samuel looked at him without fear. "I was contaminated by truth, sir, the truth that no man has the right to own another." It was a dangerous declaration. It could cost him whipping, torture, even death. But Samuel pronounced it with a serenity that disarmed any violent reaction from the colonel. Instead of anger, Nathaniel felt something different: respect, admiration, and a growing desire to know more deeply this man who dared speak of freedom while chained to slavery. "From tonight onward," said Nathaniel with controlled voice, "every evening after supper, you'll come here to the library. We'll read together. We'll discuss what we read. I want to understand how you see the world." "Why, sir?" The question was simple, but the answer was impossible. "Because I'm obsessed. Because I can't get you out of my head. Because for the first time in my life, I want to know someone deeply, intimately, in a way society and the church would never permit. Because I'm curious," he finally answered, knowing it was only a fraction of the truth. And so began a ritual that would repeat every night for the following months. While Charleston slept, while the house slaves rested in their quarters, while the city plunged into the silence of dawn, Nathaniel and Samuel met in the library. They read Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Seneca. They discussed the nature of the soul, about tyranny and freedom, about the meaning of love. Nathaniel discovered that Samuel possessed a brilliant mind, capable of arguments that would shame many doctors from Harvard or Yale. His reflections were profound, his questions disturbing. He wasn't just a slave reading words. He was a natural philosopher, someone who thought with clarity and courage about the most complex questions of human existence. And the more they talked, the more Nathaniel felt his moral armor shattering. All those decades of repression, of denial, of absolute submission to church dogma began to crumble before Samuel's presence. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel. One night, while discussing Plato's Symposium and the concept of love between equals, Samuel asked a question that changed everything. "Do you believe Plato was right, that the highest love is that which transcends the body and unites souls?" Nathaniel felt his heart race. The church teaches that the only true love is that between man and woman, sanctified by marriage. But what do you believe? Not what the church says, but what your heart knows to be true. It was the first time anyone had made that distinction in Nathaniel's life. Church versus heart. Doctrine versus inner truth. He'd always considered them one and the same. But now, before Samuel, he realized there might be an enormous distance between what he'd been taught to believe and what his soul actually felt. "I don't know," he whispered. and for the first time in his life that admission of ignorance didn't sound like weakness, but like liberation. Samuel stood and walked to the window. Outside, the full moon illuminated Charleston Harbor with silvery light. "When I was a child in Africa," he said without turning, "my father told me about two warriors from our tribe who loved each other as husband and wife. They fought side by side, died together defending our village. There was no shame in it. No sin, just two hearts that recognized each other." Nathaniel approached slowly. He stood beside Samuel, looking through the same window, so close he could feel the warmth emanating from his body. "Here it would mean death," said Nathaniel with trembling voice. "Society, the church—" "Society condemns many things that are human," interrupted Samuel. "And still, sir, what's worse, to die for loving or to live without ever having truly loved?" Those were dangerous words. Revolutionary, heretical. But to Nathaniel in that moment, they sounded like the only words of truth he'd ever heard in his entire life. Without thinking, moved by a force he couldn't control, he extended his hand and lightly touched Samuel's arm. It wasn't the touch of master to slave. It was the touch of man to man, of soul to soul. Samuel turned slowly. Their eyes met. And in the silence of that library, with only the candlelight flickering between them, both knew they had crossed a line from which they could never return. "What do you see in me?" asked Nathaniel with a hoarse voice. "A man in prison," answered Samuel. "A man who bought chains for another person but who lives in much greater chains, invisible chains, but no less real. And can you break them?" "No, sir. Only you can do that. I can only show you they exist." In that instant, Nathaniel made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He locked the library door. He approached Samuel, and for the first time in his 55 years, he allowed himself to be who he truly was. What happened that night violated all laws of God and men according to Southern society. But for the two men in that library, it was the first moment of true freedom they had known. There was no violence, no domination, just two human beings recognizing each other, shedding not just clothes but also the masks the world forced them to wear. When the church bell struck 3 in the morning, Nathaniel and Samuel were still embraced on the library floor, on the Persian rugs covering the wooden boards. Neither spoke. There were no words to name what they had shared, but both knew that from that moment on, they could no longer pretend. Obsession had transformed into love. And that love, in a society that condemned everything outside the norm, was a death sentence. What they didn't know was that someone had heard. Martha, the house servant, had awakened thirsty and, passing through the hallway, had heard sounds coming from the library. She hadn't entered, hadn't seen anything, but she knew her master well, and those sounds, whispers, loaded silences, weren't typical of a man reading alone. Something was happening in that house, something Martha didn't fully understand, but her instinct said was dangerous. The following months were the most intense and dangerous. What had begun as intellectual curiosity had transformed into something that defied all social categories of the South. During the day they maintained appearances. Nathaniel was the respected colonel, Samuel was the obedient slave, but at night they were simply two men who had found in each other something impossible: understanding, desire, and love. Nathaniel began writing compulsively in his journals, page after page, documenting every conversation, every shared moment, every thought he dared not express aloud during the day. He wrote in code, mixing Latin with English, creating religious metaphors to describe feelings religion condemned. St. Augustine took 33 years to convert his heart to God, he wrote in an entry from May 1851. "I took 55 to convert my heart to myself, and now that I've found this truth, I discover it's considered sin. But how can what makes me for the first time feel whole be sin?" But Southern society had powerful mechanisms to detect behavioral deviations, especially among the privileged classes, and the first to notice something was wrong was Reverend Jonathan Pierce, the colonel's confessor for over 20 years. Nathaniel had always been a regular and methodical penitent at private prayer meetings. He confessed small sins of thought, pride, sometimes some business lie, but for months he hadn't come. And when he finally appeared on a suffocating July afternoon, he was visibly disturbed. "Forgive me, Reverend, for I have sinned," he began with trembling voice, kneeling in the dim privacy of the church study. "It's been 3 months since my last confession." "3 months, Brother Nathaniel?" said the Reverend with concerned tone. "That's not like you. What has tormented your soul?" There was a long silence. Nathaniel struggled with himself, Part of him wanted to confess everything, seek absolution, return to the safety of doctrine. But another part, the part that had awakened with Samuel, didn't want to renounce what he'd found. Reverend, I have had impure thoughts. We all have, brother. The flesh is weak. Have you surrendered to lust? Another silence. Brother, I cannot absolve you if you don't confess. Yes, Reverend, Nathaniel finally whispered. I have sinned against chastity. The Reverend sighed with some relief. Sins of the flesh were common, especially among widowers. With a woman of ill repute? With some house slave? With a man? The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Reverend Pierce froze. For a moment he thought he'd heard wrong, but Nathaniel's heavy breathing confirmed the confession. My God, the Reverend whispered. Nathaniel, do you comprehend the gravity of what you're saying? This isn't just mortal sin, it's a crime under Southern law. It's abomination before God. I know, Reverend. That's why I'm here. How many times? Nathaniel closed his eyes. Many. Almost every night for months. And who is this? This man? A slave. Samuel. The one I bought at the market. Reverend Pierce felt his hands tremble. This was worse than he'd imagined. Not just sodomy, but also violation of the sacred hierarchy between master and slave. Did you force him? No, answered Nathaniel, and there was something painful in that denial. He consented. Actually, Reverend, I don't know who seduced whom. I only know I found in him something I've searched for my entire life without knowing. Love, said the Reverend with bitterness. You dare call this love? Yes, because that's what it is. Reverend Pierce stood abruptly. I cannot give you absolution. Not here. This sin is too grave. You must come to the church council tomorrow. The elders need to know about this. Reverend, please. Tomorrow, Nathaniel, or I myself will bring this matter to the church authorities. Nathaniel left the meeting trembling. He knew he'd made a terrible mistake by confessing, but the guilt, the pressure of the double life, everything had become unbearable. He needed absolution or confirmation that he was lost. And now he had both. That night he returned home and found Samuel waiting in the library, as always. But this time Nathaniel couldn't hide his despair. What happened, sir? Asked Samuel, alarmed by the colonel's paleness. I confessed, said Nathaniel, letting himself fall into a chair. I told everything to the Reverend, and now he's going to tell the church council. Samuel's face hardened. And what will the council do? I don't know. Perhaps excommunicate me. Perhaps report to the authorities. At minimum, demand I distance myself from you, that I sell you far from here. Samuel knelt before Nathaniel and held his hands. Then run away with me. Let's go north, to Pennsylvania, to New York. We can hide somewhere. We can— No, interrupted Nathaniel. I have responsibilities. My fortune, the society, the church. I can't simply disappear. Then what will we do? Nathaniel looked at the man he loved more than his own soul. And for the first time he had no answer, only fear. The next day, as ordered, Nathaniel appeared before the church council. He was received in an austere room with crosses on the walls and the smell of old Bibles in the air. The 5 church elders sat in judgment, their faces stern and unforgiving. Colonel Whitmore, began Elder Thompson, Reverend Pierce has informed us of your confession. We must say we are deeply shocked. You, one of the pillars of our congregation, involved in such depravities. Elders, Silence, thundered Elder Thompson. Do you understand what you've done isn't just sin? It's a crime that can lead you to prison, to loss of all your property, to complete ruin. I understand. And yet, from what Reverend Pierce told us, you show no true repentance. You dare call this love. Nathaniel raised his eyes and looked directly at the council. And in that moment, he made a decision. He wouldn't lie. He wouldn't pretend. If he was going to be destroyed, let it be by the truth. Yes, sirs, it is love. For the first time in my life, I found something true, something that makes me feel complete. And if this is sin in God's eyes, then let God judge me. But I cannot deny what I feel. The silence that followed was like a tombstone descending on a grave. The elders looked at each other, horrified. You leave us no choice, said Elder Thompson finally. You are hereby excommunicated from this congregation. Your membership is revoked. Your name will be removed from all church records, and we strongly recommend you sell that slave immediately and leave Charleston before we're forced to inform the civil authorities. Nathaniel stood. Do what you must. I've made my choice. He walked out of that church knowing he'd lost everything. But when he returned home and saw Samuel waiting, he knew he'd also gained something he'd never had before. Truth. But the story wasn't over. Because Martha, the house servant, had witnessed everything, and she'd made a decision of her own. That night, Martha entered the library where Nathaniel and Samuel sat in silence, still processing the weight of the excommunication. She closed the door behind her and faced both men with an expression mixing compassion and determination. "I've watched for months," she said quietly. "I've understood what's happening in this house. And now, with everything about to fall apart, I've decided to act." "Martha," began Nathaniel, but she interrupted. "There's a route, an underground route that takes runaway slaves north, safe houses, then ships to Canada or England. I know people who help." "Martha, I appreciate your concern, but I can't run," said Nathaniel. "I'm not suggesting you run, Colonel. I'm suggesting you free him." She pointed to Samuel. "Give him manumission papers, make him legally free. Then officially you part ways. Samuel leaves, supposedly to find work in another state. But actually, you could meet secretly at your plantation upstate, away from Charleston's eyes." It was a risky plan, but it was also the only possibility of maintaining some form of relationship without total destruction. "Why are you helping us?" asked Nathaniel. Martha smiled sadly. "Because 25 years ago I loved someone I couldn't love. Another woman who worked with me in my old master's house. They discovered us. She was sold to Mississippi, and I never knew of her again. I died a little that day, sir. I don't want to see that happen to you." Nathaniel felt tears burn his eyes. He wasn't alone. His sin, his curse, was shared by so many others living in shadows. "I'll do it," he said finally. "Samuel will be free." The next days were frantic. Nathaniel prepared manumission documents with a trusted lawyer, claiming Samuel had rendered exceptional services and deserved freedom. It was uncommon, but not illegal. The church council was satisfied knowing the slave would be removed, but fate had other plans. Because Reverend Pierce, suspicious of the colonel's behavior, had ordered one of his assistants to watch him, and that assistant, a young seminary student named Theodore, had followed Samuel when he left the next morning. Theodore saw when Samuel didn't take the main road, but a side trail leading to the woods. He saw when, hours later, Nathaniel also left the city, claiming business at his upstate property, and he saw when the two met at a small stone cottage hidden in the forest. The student ran back to town and reported everything to Reverend Pierce. The Reverend, furious at being deceived, went immediately to the magistrate, and the magistrate, feeling his authority challenged, made a terrible decision. "Issue a warrant," he ordered. "Nathaniel Whitmore will be arrested for sodomy and corruption, and that Negro will hang as an example." The next morning, when Nathaniel returned to Charleston, he was intercepted by the sheriff and his deputies. They took him forcibly to the courthouse where the town's prominent citizens had already gathered. "Nathaniel Whitmore," began the magistrate with solemn voice, "you are accused of crimes against nature, of sodomy, of corrupting public morals. How do you plead?" Nathaniel looked around. There were men he'd known for decades. Men who ran businesses, who helped widows and orphans, who considered themselves pillars of society, and now they all looked at him as if he were a monster. "Not guilty," he said with calm voice. "I loved. If loving is a crime, then I'm guilty. But it was love, not corruption." The scandal that followed was immense. Shouts, accusations, demands for immediate punishment. But Nathaniel stood firm. "Cow speak of morality," he continued, voice rising. "But how many of you keep slave concubines? How many have bastard children you don't acknowledge? How many steal from your own business partners? The difference between me and you is that I at least loved, and I'm not ashamed of it." It was his last public declaration. The magistrate ordered him jailed immediately. His properties were seized, his house was sealed, and a warrant was issued for Samuel's arrest for corrupting a white citizen. But Nathaniel had managed to send one final message through Martha, a warning, and Samuel, upon receiving it, made a decision that would change everything. That night, Samuel didn't run north as planned. Instead, he broke into the jail. Using skills learned in his years of bondage, he picked the lock and entered Nathaniel's cell. "What are you doing here?" whispered Nathaniel, horrified. "If they catch you—" "I'm not leaving you," said Samuel firmly. "Not now. Not ever. Samuel, they're going to hang you. Please go while you still can." Samuel shook his head. "I've lived as a slave my entire life, always doing what others commanded, always denying who I was. But you taught me something, Nathaniel. You taught me that love is worth dying for, and I'd rather die free with you than live enslaved without you." In that moment, Martha appeared in the shadows. "I have horses ready. Both of you. We can reach the North Carolina border by dawn. It was their last chance. Nathaniel looked at Samuel, then at Martha, and for the first time in his life he chose love over duty. They escaped that night, riding through dark forests and hidden trails. Martha guided them to the first safe house on the Underground Railroad. From there, other conductors took over, moving them north through a network of abolitionists and free blacks willing to risk everything for freedom. But the story doesn't end with escape. Colonel Nathaniel Whitmore and Samuel reached Canada in the fall of 1851. They settled in a small town outside Toronto, where Nathaniel found work as a schoolteacher and Samuel as a carpenter. They lived under assumed names, presenting themselves as business partners sharing a modest house. For the first time in their lives they were free, not just from slavery's physical chains, but from society's moral chains. They could love openly, though carefully. They built a life together that, while hidden from most, was theirs. Meanwhile, in Charleston, the scandal raged for years. Nathaniel's property was auctioned off, his name erased from church records, his reputation destroyed. But something unexpected happened. His journals, which Martha had saved before the authorities could confiscate them, were secretly copied and distributed among abolitionists. Those pages became powerful testimony. They showed not just a forbidden love story, but a devastating critique of Southern hypocrisy. Nathaniel had written about slavery, about sexual repression, about the tyranny of church authority, about the falseness of an elite that preached morality but practiced every vice. Frederick Douglass himself read portions of the journals in 1854 and wrote, "Here is proof that slavery corrupts not just the enslaved, but the enslaver. It creates a society where love itself becomes criminal, where the most natural human emotions must be hidden like contraband." Nathaniel and Samuel lived in Canada for 37 years. They never returned to the American South, but they never forgot where they came from or what they'd sacrificed for freedom. When Nathaniel died in 1888 at age 92, Samuel was by his side. The local Canadian newspaper noted the passing of a respected schoolteacher and his longtime companion, not knowing the full story of who they'd been. Samuel lived 3 more years. On his deathbed in 1891, he asked to be buried beside Nathaniel with a simple inscription, "Two souls, one love, finally free." Their graves still exist in that small Canadian cemetery, and though the names on the headstones are false, the truth beneath them is eternal. 2 men who loved in a time when love was forbidden. 2 men who chose freedom over fear. 2 men whose story reminds us that love, in all its forms, has always existed and has always been worth fighting for. The Colonel's regret didn't come from the love he felt. It came from not having the courage to live it openly from the beginning. But even that regret, in the end, transformed into liberation. Because by choosing freedom over reputation, by choosing love over approval, Nathaniel proved that love, even love the world condemns, can be stronger than fear. And you? Would you have had the courage to love against the rules? To defy everything for what your heart knew was true? Leave your answer in the comments, because history isn't just about the past. It's about the choices we make today, about the courage we have or don't have to be who we truly are. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and share. Because there are stories that need to be told. Stories that books tried to hide, but that human memory, stubborn and resistant, kept alive. Stories of love that defied empires. Stories that remind us that to be human is above all to have the courage to love.